Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the projected changes in physical properties of the Northwest Atlantic Shelf. So first, the off-shelf region of Atlantic Canada can be looked at as a confluence zone between the warm and salty northeast flowing Gulf Stream, the white, the white arrows in the figure, and the colder and fresher southwest flowing Labrador Current, the black arrows. The dashed arrows indicate mixing of waters and occurrence in the slope area. The predominance of the two water masses has been related to the North Atlantic Oscillation, NAO, according to Brickman and others, during periods of low NAO, for example, the 1960s, cold slope water predominates, indicating more transport of the Labrador Current around the Grand Banks, with associated colder and fresher waters going into the shelf region downstream. During periods of high NAO, for example, from 1980 to 1995, the opposite occurs with warm and saltier slope water dominating and reducing transport of Labrador Current water around the tail of the Grand Banks. But we have climate change, and climate change has been impacting and will continue to impact ocean over the world continental shelf, while in general warming due to accumulating atmospheric CO2 is likely to continue. These trends might be significantly aggravated or ameliorated by regional processes. So we need to improve the information about the possible future ocean dynamics and the possible physical mechanisms responsible for the future climate system. To address that, we are trying to estimate how many changes in the temperature and salinity structure are associated with global warming, and how this anthropogenic induced variability will affect the biogeochemical cycle in the Northwest Atlantic Shelf. To do that, firstly, we want to know what are the main modes of variation of temperature and salinity patterns in the Northwest Atlantic Shelf in a changing climate scenario, and can we identify the change in the water masses, structure, its boundaries, and the repercussions in the biochemical cycling? So to answer these questions, we have global climate simulations, and because future climate depends on future human behavior, which is unpredictable, scenarios are used to characterize the possible climate states. In this case, to analyze the variability of the Northwest Atlantic Ocean, the data of temperature and salinity that we are working with were obtained from the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, GFDL, Climate Model version 2.6. The GFDL group performed a set of experiments in order to isolate the effect of the increasing CO2. Firstly, they run a control experiment at which atmospheric CO2 is held constant at pre-industrial values. And then they do an experiment called transient 2x CO2, in which CO2 was increased by 1% per year until the CO2 level doubles the pre-industrial concentration. It happens in year 70, and then the CO2 is kept constant for 10 more years. So here I'm showing the output of temperature and salinity at area 1, which is close to the Gulf Stream position. The anomalies are relative to the monthly climatology from the ADGR control simulation. So here we can see at the upper panel how temperature anomalies tend to increase not only over the time axis, the x-axis, but also in the vertical axis. That means that high temperature manifests itself more uniformly and deeper when the CO2 increases. We can also see how salinity, the plot at the middle panel, increases the first 600 meters, and that warmer and saltier water is the result of a stronger influence of the Gulf Stream water. At the bottom panel here, we can see the difference between surface density and the density at 50, 100, 200, and 400 meters. This difference is called delta rho, and I want to highlight that delta rho has kind of oscillations, but in general, the trend is to decrease around 10% over the time span. That means a less stratified water column, especially when CO2 doubles the pre-industrial concentration. I also want to show that the whole area doesn't behave in the same way. So if we took an area 2, the red square in the map, which is close to the tail of the Grand Banks, we can see that the warming trend happens as it do in the area 1, but these changes are stronger in the subsurface water, which is between 50 meters and 300 meters. Here, this dark red in this panel. However, in terms of salinity, the middle right panel, it is notable the addition of fresh water in the upper layer and the increase of salinity in the subsurface water. That produces more stratification in the water column, as we see in the bottom right panel here, where delta rho tends to increase over years. This higher stratification potentially weakens the deep convection and might lead to a reduction in heat transport. So one of the known impacts of increasing atmospheric CO2 is the northerly shift of the Gulf Stream. We also wanted to explore the position of the Gulf Stream in the control and warming simulation. So we use the Gulf Stream North Wall Index, following Joyce and other job, who defined this index to be the location of the 15 degrees isotherm at 200 meters. So in this figure here, we can see that the annual mean position in the control simulation is located in a well-defined area in the left corner of the domain. While in the warming case, here, every year the Gulf Stream is moving further north, which increases the proportion of warm slope water going into the Northwest Atlantic Shelf. So in terms of, in order to determine the main spatial patterns of variability and estimate how much changes are associated with global warming, we carry out an EOF analysis using the three-dimensional fields of temperature and salinity from the warming experiment of the GFDL model. So the objective of the EOF analysis is to decompose the dominant spatial patterns of the variance. They are called EOF. And each EOF is associated with a time series or principal component, you see, which represents the evolution of the EOF over time. And each EOF represents a portion of the total variance. So we did an EOF analysis with the temperature data, and we found that more than 50% of the variance was explained by the first EOF, which represents mainly the dynamic between the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current. So here in the upper panel, we can see the horizontal distribution of the first EOF, 15, 200, and 750 meters. So we can see that all the components of the EOF are negative, and the PC score, the green line at the bottom figure here, has a negative slope. That means that the entire area is getting warmer, especially the southeast area at the surface, and the slope water at 200 meters depth. The variability of the deep water is insignificant compared to the surface and subsurface variability. So now we have 4 transects through the Gulf of Maine, T1, Scotia Shelf, T2, Sun Laurentian Channel, T3, and the Labrador Shelf. And we can see how the maximum variability is concentrated in the slope area where the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current mix. Also, we found a high correlation between the maximum latitude reached by the Gulf Stream north wall and the PC scores, meaning that the 51% of variance explained by the first EOF is due to the northern shift of the Gulf Stream. The second EOF explained 5% of the total variance, and it's associated to the difference between subsurface water and the colder temperature moving from the Arctic. As we can see, the positive or the red values in the northern area. And in the transect 4, we can see that all the values are positive, and we can see also how this upper layer becomes thinner when we move from transect 3 to transect 1. So this EOF mode might be more associated with the natural dynamic and mixing of the main currents. So we did also another EOF analysis with the salinity data set. And here we get that almost 1/4 of the total variance is explained by the first EOF, while the second EOF explained less than 10%. This first EOF represents the weakening of the influence of the Labrador Current and how it concentrates more in the northern area, making the shallow water and the water in the Labrador Shelf fresher, while the southern waters and the subsurface water in the slope area become saltier, the green color here in the plot. The downward trend of the PC scores, the green line, this green line in the bottom figure, is highly correlated also with the increasing latitude of the north wall. So it means that the retreat of the Labrador Current and the northerly shift of the Gulf Stream occurs simultaneously and stand for around 26% of the variance of salinity. So in order to get a better understanding of the nature of the EOF modes, I did the same analysis, but with the outputs of the control experiment. And here I'm showing the correlation coefficients between each pair of orthogonal function, the black numbers, and their respective principal components, the purple numbers. And we can see how the second EOF of temperature and salinity are quite correlated to the first EOF of the control experiment, meaning that these 6-second EOF are standing more for natural patterns than a response of the climate change. So in conclusion, in a warming scenario, approximately 50% of the total variance of temperature and 30% of variance are due, and 30% of salinity variance are due to the retreat of Labrador Current and the northern shift of the Gulf Stream. The remaining part of the variance might be associated with natural processes. So the next step in our research is to use these dominant modes of variability to force our regional Atlantic model and simulate future periods. In this way, we are considering the effect of long-term climate change signal and neglecting the somewhat uncertain future projection at higher frequencies. So the study of the water structure, boundaries, and water masses structure, boundaries, and repercussions for the biogeochemical cycling is something that I'm working on in this moment. I'm using our regional model instead of the climate model for do that.
Great, thanks for that interesting talk. I'm sure has already been some questions out there, but I'm sure there's some more questions. If anyone wants to either jump in or raise your hand, either way. Oh, we got one from Eric. Do you see that? I can read it out. Was the trend from the first EOF mode time series in the Gulf Stream Index removed prior to calculating the correlation? And if not, then the correlation is not very meaningful. Correlation between two trending time series.
This one? It's a minute.
Between the first EOF mode time series and the Gulf Stream Index.
This one, yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what we want to know, how the main trend of it could change, how the main trend could change over time, and how this contribute to the apparent variability in the period. So that's why we didn't remove the trend, that we want to keep this warming trend.
Any other questions out there? Nobody? Okay, well, thank you, Lina, for a very